How's everybody doing today? All right. So for some of you, this is the final lap. Well done. Hang in there. And for the other half of you, good morning. Welcome. Glad you could join us this afternoon. And so we'll have a fun mix. So I'm going to do a couple of things. My topic is deterrence in the defense industrial base. I'll just briefly mention my associations so you understand how. I'll talk a little bit about the defense industrial base and what it does, recognizing there's a pretty wide range of understanding. I will tell you, I first came into the Pentagon in 1989 to work for Army Intelligence as a program budget analyst. I knew next to nothing about the defense industrial base and cared even less. And then over time, as I moved up through the system, much like they talk about moving from caring about tactics to logistics, I started to really understand and care about all of the stuff and all of the equipment and where it comes from, as it started to drive my activities as Deputy Secretary. All right, so first, what is NDIA? NDIA is a nonprofit educational association. It was founded over 100 years ago after it was clear to the US military and the US industrial base were ill-prepared for World War I. So a series of retired Army officers and individuals from the private sector got together and said, we shouldn't let this happen again. Today we have over 1,700 corporate and 65,000 individual members. We represent all sectors and all sizes of organizations, and the majority of our members are small businesses. So for 100 years, we've provided a platform through which leaders in government, industry, and academia can get together and collaborate to provide solutions to our national security challenges. So specifically, how do we do this? So the first thing is we identify issues that affect and where a resolution would contribute to the strength, resilience, and the capacity of the defense industrial base. We do studies, we do analysis, and so on. We also get a collaborative community between government, industry, and academia to talk about these issues, and we provide subject matter experts. So if the government reaches out to us and says, how do we accelerate foreign military sales? We bring a series of people together, not a company, but people from dozens of companies who can represent what are some of the alternatives. And last, we convene legal and ethical forums for the exchange of ideas, information, and viewpoints and capabilities, which sounds really boring, but is actually one of the most important things. So I'm going to wander periodically. They've given me a movable mic, and somebody taught me that if I stand still for too long, even a bad sniper can shoot you, so you just periodically just move. When I was in government and I wanted to talk to a company, the lawyers would say to me, you could, but if you meet with that firm, you have to be willing to meet with every firm. And there are thousands of them, and your calendar's not that fluid. And I'd say, okay, never mind. And I go back to my office. Well, this is not helpful, right? This is not helpful when we have a system who's based on using the innovation of the private sector when we have these barriers between government and industry. So part of what the association does is we turn to government and say, we're going to have a conference. We got one coming up in Baltimore, chemical, biological, nuclear issues. You don't have to pick which company you want to talk to. We've issued an open invitation. Any vendor who wants to come can show up. But this is the subject. Would you like to come and speak to that audience about what your challenges are, what your requirements are? So now the government is free to talk about its problems, which is the number one thing the industry needs to understand, which is what problem are you trying to solve? Because in some areas it's been solved somewhere else, and industry can find it and bring it to government. And then government can come and see not only the audience, but can listen to the audience and visit booths and things and see what solutions are out there that it was not aware of. So actually the bulk of our activity is having these types of forums so that the government people do not have to worry they've done an ethics problem by telling people what they really would like industry to make for them. And industry can actually produce solutions that matter to the government. So that's a key part of trying to make this process work well for everybody. All right. So what is the defense industrial base and why is it important to our national security? So the defense industrial base, or DIB for short, for those of you who are from the military and need an acronym to get through it, it's the network of people, organizations, facilities, and resources that provide a nation with defense-related materials, products, and services, which sounds like a type of definition you're supposed to memorize, but doesn't mean much. It's either in the time of crisis, we call it the arsenal of democracy, and at other times we call it half of the military-industrial complex. So I leave it to you which phrase you prefer to use, but it includes university laboratories, federally funded research and development centers, public and private companies of all sizes and industries, from the largest multinationals right down to the mom and pop shops. It doesn't just produce the large weapon systems that you see and think about. It's the munitions, the uniform, the food, the equipment, the gas, the electricity, the water, the medical supplies, and it moves beyond that to services, from maintenance, developing and updating and patching software, researching new technologies, all the way through things. So in today's military, if you're thinking about the defense industrial base, it is everything beyond the soldier. Everything they ride in, everything they use, everything they eat, everything they use to power it, everything they wear comes from the defense industrial base. The organizations that provide these goods and services are just the first layer of what we call the defense industrial base. We refer to the organizations who contract directly with the government as prime contractors, or primes for short. Sometimes that's used as a shorthand for some of the largest defense contractors. They'll call them the primes. But truth is, small businesses are often the prime. But you'll think of Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, also called RTX, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and General Dynamics. These are the largest and most prominent examples of primes. But the DIB doesn't stop there. There's an entire ecosystem of companies supporting the primes and providing components and services to enable the primes and to deliver on their government contracts. We call these subcontractors, and subcontractors can have subcontractors. And this relationship can continue down through layers and layers of the system. And when you think that's weird, start for a minute with an airplane. And it has to have an engine, which is probably not made by the company who makes the airplane. And the people who make the engines don't make metal. They buy that metal from other people, and typically they buy it already formed into the shape they want. Screws, bolts, panels, whatever. Those people they buy from who do the bending probably didn't weld the metal either. So there's another company who makes metal, and behind there's another company who mines the raw materials, and at some point you discover you're standing in China, and that's part of your supply system, and you didn't know it. That's when we talk about supply chain, and everyone's concerned, do you understand your supply chain? Do the same thing down the sensor side, right? You've got a radar, you've got a sensor for an air defense weapon system. Somewhere down there, there's software, and you're not sure where it was written, unless you're paying attention. And somewhere down there is a chip. And the question is, do you know where the chips come from? Do you know where the software is written? Do you know if some factory gets damaged in some location, whether or not that's going to stop your entire production of that system? Because, like they ran into with cars during COVID, if I don't have the chip, I can't finish the automobile. If I don't have the sensor, I can't finish the air defense system. So that makes life complicated. We do surveys every year called Vital Signs. You're welcome to go to our website and look at it. And so we start asking questions of our members. How much of your supply chain can you see? Only 43% of them in the private sector respondents reported having high visibility into more than half of their supply chain. 34% reported having visibility into just 25% or less. And this lack of visibility isn't for lack of trying, but entirely due to the web of some contractors and suppliers that make up the supply chain. If you think that's strange, ask yourself, do you know where the lawnmower was made and where the parts were made of the lawnmower in your own garage? Odds are you don't. At most, you might know the name of the company that sold it to you. This is why supply chain security is such an important issue for the DIB and for DoD. Losing a critical supplier or suppliers who are the sole producer of an essential item can have significant reverberations in the delivery of materials to our warfighters. So there's really two issues. One is friendly supplier, something happens to them, they get annoyed, they quit working with the Department of Defense, their factory has damage, they switch product lines, owner retires, all of a sudden the supply stops. But the alternative is somebody tampering with your supply system and you didn't know it because you didn't realize that the part you were buying has some subparts made somewhere else. Moving on, there are places where the government buys commercial products, things like common goods and services, electricity, printing paper, and so on. So we have that. However, most of the DIB operates under very specific requirements that can create a unique market environment that has a major implication for how those companies operate. The companies in the DIB cannot function like the private sector where you build a better mousetrap and the world comes to your door. You can build a better mousetrap in the defense private industrial sector for the DIB and no one will care because they don't know who you are and it doesn't match the government's requirements because it's the wrong color. So in the DIB, your only customer is the US government and it's only if they have asked you for it. Even if you are selling to a foreign government, you almost always need the permission of the US government first. There's a name for this in economics. A monopoly is when there is one supplier. You want to buy electricity, you got to buy it from that one supplier. They have leverage over you. The alternative is a monopsony. There is only one buyer. Most of you can bid, but there's nobody else to sell to. So if that supplier doesn't buy from you, potentially sends you out of business. So this creates significant effects on the way the industry operates. The most significant is which contractors must wait for a contract before they do anything. So think about this for a second. I'll use the example. If you ran a grocery store, you would stock your grocery store with items that you think that anyone in your local town or county or community was interested in. And you wouldn't have to be precisely right. Many people would come in and they wouldn't want most of your stuff, but they'd want some things. And they'd buy those items, and they would look at your choices. In the government side, when government contracting, there is no such thing. You cannot get it mostly right because only one person making the buy decision. And that person is working off of a sheet of paper. So it's much more like remodeling somebody's house. You don't get to do anything until the person says, I am hiring you to remodel my house. And so they're not going to order lumber or windows or cabinets for you if you haven't signed a contract with them. They're not going to take that financial risk that they've got because there's 100% loss and there's no alternative buyer for that particular cabinet. They're working with you. And they're going to need to be able to keep pace with you as you go through it. And just like with the government, you can change your mind midway. If you don't notice, we have a renovation going on in my house, hence the analogy. In the government process, the first thing they start with is called a request for proposals. It's a document that goes out that lays out a contract opportunity. Contractors will then put together and submit what they call a proposal, and they will bid to win the contract. There's an entire industry that teaches you how to answer these contracts. And people have bad habits that have to be beaten out of them when they respond to government proposals. If the government asks for ACE and you think ABC is a much more logical order, the answer is ACE. Do not change the order in which the government asked the question or you will lose. This is a high-risk endeavor, and that's not the way the system works. According to the DoD Office of Small Business Programs, it is not uncommon for a small business to spend hundreds of hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars developing proposals that they don't win. I used to do this for a financial management firm. We'd bid time and material contracts to provide services to government CFOs and others to help them improve their internal controls. I spent a great deal of time trying to understand the proposals and respond to them. And the thing I learned from being on the government contractor side versus the government side was, however clear you think when you wrote the document, there are 101 questions that you did not think of that the reader of the contract is going, I wonder if they want this or if they want that. And that's why it's important to have those conversations before you put it out. Once you put the bid in as the contractor, your next step is to wait. The government may communicate with the bidders to obtain additional information while they compare bids, but often it entails waiting in silence, often for many months, typically 3 to 6 months to hear back from the government on a relatively straightforward proposal. If at some point the government finally makes a decision to accept the bid, then they'll award the bid to a winning contractor. Now, finally, the contractor can begin to work on providing the good or service at the cost, timeline, and contract they negotiated with the government. Now, here is where the power of the private sector kicks in. Having been in government and tried to hire people, it is an extraordinarily long process. It is not in the private sector. If I have a contract that begins in a week, I am hiring people this week if I am not moving them from other contracts. But typically, I cannot carry very many people who aren't working. So in the private sector, part of what makes them efficient is how quickly they release and hire people in order to not be paying people to sit around. This is why it's very important to the contractor to know when the contract starts. Because if they hire a bunch of people and you start the contract a month later, they've just paid them all for a month of doing nothing. And that's all a loss. So they want to get very careful about how they do this. But once they do, they can find the contractors, they can find subject matter expertise, they can bring them on board, they can team with other firms if they haven't already. All of the things that we see that makes the private sector in the US economy so efficient takes effect when now the government has said, build me this, and the contractor starts getting into the operations of doing that. then you start to see some of those things pick up in the tempo. This is also from the point of view of the contractor's business. This is the only point where they have any concept that they will eventually receive payment for their work. So one of the things you hear about people in government saying is, why isn't industry investing in X? We have certainly given them the demand signal. And you say, well, what is your demand signal? And the answer is the undersecretary gave a speech. Lovely. Lovely that the undersecretary gives a speech. But the number of undersecretaries who give speeches and the number of contracts that don't come back is actually quite high, and the undersecretary's speech is not a binding legal commitment. If you're in industry and you don't want to get fired, you make sure you have a signed contract before you start spending your company's money, and you know what you're likely to do. The other one that just makes it fun, because I spent most of my life in the government and we think it's entertaining to do these things to people, our contracts tend to say things like, well done, great job, we love your product, we want 10,000 of them, 1,000 next year. And by the way, when you've ramped up the production and you've got it up and going and you produce 1,000, we may just end this contract after 1 year. Maybe 10 years, but maybe 1 year. We'll tell you when we get there. And you have to live with that, right? And you just imagine the effect that creates on trying to manage your investments when everything is well done, Wesley, good job, I may kill you in the morning, right? There's sort of there's a series of movie references I will throw in. Your audience looks like it's much better than my own staff, who looks at me when I make Monty Python references and they don't know who they are. It's very, very depressing. But the challenge is the government is typically too unpredictable, and the RFPs are too specific to build on speculation. Now, there are some places where you see this happening. You see companies investing in building out a capability they think could help them across multiple proposals, or firms developing parts of UAVs in order to get ahead of it. But there's a limit to how much you can do, because when the government issues the RFP, it either matches exactly what they asked for, or you're not in. And however much you may have thought that other trade-offs were rational in the trade space, that wasn't the trade-off the government made, and now you're not an effective competitor. So the key takeaway from all of this that makes the defense industrial base different is you get the industrial base that you contract for. If you only want to buy munitions in small quantities because you're only going to consume them at a training level rate, you'll have an industrial base that can only build munitions in small quantities. It has no capacity to ramp up because it has no facility to ramp up because you told them you didn't want it, right? So you think about this when you're pricing. You ask me to build a certain type of munition for you. I give you a plan to build that munition, and I price in the ability to double production within 90 days in case of a conflict. And my competitor doesn't. You'll pick my competitor because they're cheaper, because you didn't ask for the surge capacity and you didn't price it and you didn't value it in your valuation criteria. So when the contracting officer is going for the lowest price that meets the requirements, lovely things like surge capacity only count if they're in the requirements. I will also tell you, if the vendor chooses on their own free will to carry extra capacity and people, the contracting officers from DCAA and DCMA ding them for having this extra overhead and fine them and penalize them for doing so. So we remind them, don't do that. At the same time, we're saying, why haven't you done this? Makes it fun. Now, the thing about this is, when we do this right, you get an incredible advantage over other countries. You have a private market that is interacting with the commercial world and developing innovations and new processes that allows you to do things in very different ways and breakthroughs in new technologies that can be applied to government. And you have a government stating a set of requirements and watching the solutions come in to solve their problems. When this works, these two forces are pulling in the same direction. They're delivering cutting-edge technologies and weapon systems that ensure our warfighters are never in a fair fight. And for most of our history, this has worked most of the time pretty well. There are always challenges, but that process versus what the Soviets use of a centrally planned military structure has given us the advantage in technology. A healthy DIB doesn't just help a country win wars, it also is a very effective deterrent. If you're deciding whether to go pick a fight with another country, the first thing you might want to look at is what they have on your border. And then the second thing is, how long are they going to be able to stay in this fight? And is the long run to their advantage or to mine? Because if the long run isn't to your advantage, then unless you can win very quickly, starting a war is a losing proposition. There's a reason why we don't ask ourselves the question, is Taiwan going to invade China? They could have more advanced equipment, they could get tactical surprise, but everyone knows that in the long run, even if the Chinese were sleeping, they would eventually build a force large enough to crush whatever Taiwan invaded with and drive them out. You see this example in World War II in both the European and Pacific theater. In Japan, when they attacked Pearl Harbor, they had at the time 9 aircraft carriers, and the US had only 6. But by 1945, Japan had built 11 more carriers, and the US had built 25 more carriers. If you want to include different types of carriers, the numbers go up even more dramatically. But the point is, every year that goes by, we were just going to get stronger. And this was never going to end well for them if it didn't end for them quickly. The soaring DIB was also our ability to outcompete the Soviet Union during the Cold War. As the war progressed, we had a stronger economy. It allowed us to produce more innovative solutions that created cost imposition on them. The deep strike capabilities that the Army developed as part of air-land battle wreaked havoc with the Soviet plans and formations and structures, and really created a small expense on our side, created a big expense on yours. It allowed the United States to decrease the amount of money it spent from its GDP on defense while staying ahead, and at the same time forcing the Soviets to spend ever-increasing amounts of a small GDP, all up until the point that they drove themselves into bankruptcy. So industrial strength, much like the military nuclear deterrent, goes a long way towards keeping somebody else from starting the fight in the first place. All right. But this is where the story changes. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, and with it, our sole peer competitor disappears. In response, the US dramatically reduces our force structure, dials back our research, and enjoys the peace dividend. However, as we were focused on combating transnational terrorism and an increasingly aggressive Russian state in the early 2000s, China rose in the Soviet Union's place. While we had a significant advantage in GDP over the Soviet Union, especially at the end of the Cold War, we do not have that situation with China. In 1985, China's economy was 15% of the US economy. By 1921, the IMF said that US economy was only 40% larger than China on an exchange rate basis. Here's the point where I'm going to push everybody's economic knowledge. We have exchange rate and purchasing power parity. Exchange rate says, if I value something at how much you spent to make it, what's the size of your economy? So if it takes you 3 people to make something in the US an hour and 3 people in China to make an hour, the US will have a larger economy on that because we paid them more. Purchasing power parity says, I don't care what you paid them, what did they make for the time and energy you put into it? And in purchasing power parity, the Chinese economy is 20% larger than ours. So if you look at straight dollar value, the US is bigger. If you look at physical output, China's economy is bigger. Whichever option you prefer to take, the answer is you have a peer competitor. So let's take steel. US and USSR both produce steel, I think about a 20% share of the world's each. Today, the PRC produces over half of the world's steel, and the US produces less than 5% of the world's steel. If you want to get in a race of construction on something that's heavily dependent on steel, that's a number to know. Compared with the USSR, China has a larger economy, more technologically advanced, it dominates key industries, and it is better at stealing key technologies to stay competitive. So China today presents a more capable rival than the Soviet Union ever did. I tend to be a little careful about implying threats because of the two. The Chinese leaders tend not to bang their shoe on the table and say, we will bury you, which is a little more obvious of a behavior than the Russians would do. But in the military operations, you have to look at the capability and intentions, because the leadership decision-making can swing. But as a capability, the Chinese are more significant than the Soviet Union ever was. But the problem is, we still have our post-Cold War industrial base. We have one that is designed to support low volumes of munition productions, low rates of weapon systems. We walked away from a large number of large platforms. I think you look at the last time an Abrams tank was produced new as opposed to refurbished, and you have to go back pretty far in time. This is not Eisenhower's defense industrial base. When Eisenhower gave his speech in '62, 49% of the federal budget went to defense. Today, it's about 12 to 13%. And so the industrial base resilience required to support the US in great power competition was sacrificed at the end of the Cold War and as part of the 1990s peace dividend. And because of this, all of the readiness indicators that we would look to say, how healthy is the DIB, are all going in the wrong direction, and they've atrophied. So I talked a little bit about the reduced government investment in defense as a share of federal spending. But just take companies. In the last 5 years, 17,000 companies is estimated to have left the defense ecosystem. The Department of Defense estimates that in the last 10 years, it lost 40% of its small businesses. That's the DoD estimate. So the private sector firms are not looking at this as a promising place to be. And so when you get the industrial base that's shrinking, that makes the challenge of competition harder. We also have fewer workers. This is a much bigger country than it was in 1985, but in 1985, we had 3 million workers in the defense industry, and by 2021, we had 1.1 million workers in the defense industrial base. And you'll see this in a number of places. The one that's making the most attention right now is the submarine industrial base. With ranges of the Pacific and long-range missiles that can hit surface platforms, undersea submarines are a major strategic advantage of the United States. We would love to have 2 a year. We'd love to have 3 a year of the Virginia-class submarines. Right now, the industry is producing 1.2. Not for lack of ask at this point, but it's a lack of people who are cleared and qualified to do the welding, interested in going into that line of work, concerned that another sequestration will push them right back out, or another drawdown, which is why we ended up at 1 previously in the first place. So all of these things that we tend to do, hit the brake and the accelerator, sends a signal to people about whether or not this is actually stable work and whether or not they should get in it. So there's a real challenge on the Navy side when they're trying to do this, to try and see it. The Army tends to see these issues more on the recruiting side, but you'll have the same issue with some of your weapon systems and platforms for the Department of the Army. If you stop buying certain types of equipment, companies stop producing them. And then when you get back into that business and say, we'd like to buy them again, the answer is, lovely, we'll go see who we got who still remembers how to do that, or we'll have to create it. The other side effect is we have limited surge capacity. When you have, over the last several years, an emphasis on lowest marginal cost, what you're telling companies is single supplier, no surge capacity, that's the lower price to get a winning bid, and that's the type of bid you get. And that reduces the resilience of your industrial base. And of course, on top of all of this, we do not have budget predictability. In 14 of the last 15 years, the US government has operated under a continuing resolutions that are not just a week long, but now sometimes months long, sometimes half a year long. If anyone wants to in the Q&A session, just ask me about CRs and I'll use the entire rest of the time to denounce them, because I used to have to do this for a living in front of congressional hearings. But there's very few things you can do that are as destructive to the Department of Defense and the industrial base than to stand on the air hose for 6 months while you decide whether or not to say go. If I had to just summarize it in layman's terms, you're deciding how many months of a head start you want to give your rivals. If you've invented a new technology and you have a new requirement and you absolutely want it, and the head of the Armed Service and the Secretary of Defense asks for it, and OMB approves it, amazingly. President signs off on it, goes to the Hill. The authorizers like it. The appropriators amazingly agree with the authorizers. The Republicans and the Democrats see. Everyone's holding hands and singing Kumbaya, and the CR says, can we give the Chinese another 3 months head start? Or maybe 6. Let's do that. And then we do it, right? So they're bad. All right, so the effect of all of this is you get the DIB that you ordered. If you don't price in or ask for resilience, you are not going to be buying resilience. If you do not order certain types of platforms, you will not have them. If you do not want munitions in quantity, you will not get them, both when you didn't want them or then later when you decided you did. There was a recent war game done by CSIS where they ran a conflict with China over some period of time. It was an unclassified study. One can argue about their assumptions, or basically they have the US running out of munitions in weeks, if not short months. Certainly not a long conflict. That's not a very encouraging deterrent for somebody who's trying to decide whether or not you're willing to go toe-to-toe to them. And because of the limited profit margins and opportunities for growth, anyone you talk to will show you the defense flat line going out is flat or inflation. You have a challenge trying to get industry to support building or maintaining workforces and factories that are to produce munitions they have no guarantee are going to be sold. You can't ask people to build a factory on speculation that at some point the government will recognize it should have been doing something else, and then they're going to have to absorb the hit. Particularly because even if they guess right, there's no reward for it, you'll probably get it cost plus, and therefore you will not make the risk-reward trade-off that you would see in other spaces. And you can't afford to lose the money because you're a private sector company. That's part of what drives you to efficiency. It's also what keeps you from being afraid of going out of business. The thing to remember about the defense industrial base is it competes in the private market. It's part of its strength. It's part of its innovation. But it also means it's got to pay private sector wages in order to draw people. If we value the software and the games that come out of a first-person shooter and pay a premium for those software writers to develop those really cool games, and we price that higher in the market than we do the person building the simulator for the US Army soldier who's got to practice being in a real battle, the software writers will go to the video game and not to the soldier, because we've told them this is more valuable to us than this because of what we're paying in the market. These are the things we have to pay attention to. It's a huge advantage, but it does mean we're competing with the entire rest of the US economy for talent, for skill, for labor, for interest to try and bring them in, and for capital. This is the other part, which is private sector, in order to expand, in order to do things, has to borrow money from the bank or the lenders, the private equity firms, and build things. And so they compete with the private sector. So let's talk a bit about market capitalization as a metric. Investors use market capitalization to determine how much a company is worth, as determined by the total market value of all outstanding shares. So number of shares outstanding, price per share, multiply the two. If you do that for Tesla, the market says Tesla is worth $554 billion. Not because you could sell everything it owned for $554 billion, but because when you look ahead to the future at what the markets it in is doing and the profit margins in those markets, they believe the return would justify a valuation of $554 billion. If you combined the 5 largest defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and General Dynamics, you have a market capitalization of $508 billion. The market believes Tesla is worth more than the largest players in the defense industrial base because it's looking at their future, and it's looking at who's going to buy Teslas, and it's looking at the US government and what it's going to spend on defense. So whatever you think of the defense industrial concept being big, the market sees them as smaller than Tesla. Another example of this showcase the difference between the DIB and commercial companies is operating margin, which measures how much profit a company can make after paying the cost of production, employee salaries and materials. So in 2023, the top industrial-based companies posted an average operating margin of 8%. The top 100 firms in the S&P averaged 22%. And these are the companies that are competing for capital. And so why is the number so stark? Well, the answer is Apple did not build that iPhone that you put in your pocket at cost plus. And they're not selling it to you at 5% of above what it costs them to make it. They're selling it to you at the price you value it at, which can be many times orders larger than that. Whereas in government, the people who sign contracts tend to sign them either on a cost plus basis, I pay you the cost it costs you to make it plus some additional margin, or some other similar formula that reduces the risk-reward calculation. Now, This is all dark, heavy, bad, life is a mess, but let's get a little bit direction. So the Department of Defense has recognized this challenge, particularly with Ukraine. When Ukraine came in and we saw the challenges of munitions supporting a conflict over there, never mind one that we were in with a higher demand signal, they realized we need to do something differently. So they have produced a national defense industrial strategy that lays out a number of different things they can do to try and strengthen the industrial base and the government's relation with it. This is wonderful. It's the first time it's been done, and maybe either ever or in a very long time. So kudos to Bill LaPlante and all of his team who put this together. And it states one of the things that NDI has been saying for a number of years, which is that your current industrial base is not sized for great power competition. The strategy says, quote, the current and future strategic environment requires immediate, comprehensive, and decisive action in strengthening and modernizing our defense industrial base ecosystem to ensure the security of the United States and our allies and partners. True, well said, well done. Some people have thrown a few rocks at this because it's a strategy. My recommendation is people should remember everyone has the same reaction to a strategy, which is, that's great, but it doesn't do anything until it's implemented. And the answer is, it's true, but it didn't claim it was the implementation plan. It said it was the strategy. So thank them for doing that, and they'll work on the implementation next, which is what they're doing. And we will work with them on getting that to the right place. In our vital signs reports in 23 and 24, we flagged 5 areas of particular value. One is budget stability and sufficiency. As long as you're doing erratic buying, you are scaring people out of the market. And you're not going to get more munitions if you're not spending more money on more munitions, and you have to align those. Digital modernization, this is a key opportunity for both government and industry to be able to do more and do it more efficiently. Foreign military sales and technology cooperation. Part of what we want to do is strengthen our allies and partners. And when you do foreign military sales, you get standardization on equipment, on communications, and it's an essential part of helping our allies and friends defend themselves and helping our countries to work together. You need to restore the industrial readiness, capacity, and infrastructure. Many of these things are very old and there's not an incentive to upgrade them. And of course, as one I started with, is the resilient supply chain. These reports focus on the key areas where government and industry can partner together to better manage time and money and in support of our common objectives. In addition to emphasizing the importance of effectively managing time and money and restoring industrial readiness, the Vital Signs 2023 report also tried to seek out other areas of tension that cause challenges to us as we move forward. One of which is that the defense industrial base operates under increased scrutiny for doing things that are common in the private sector, which makes it challenging to compete. We also have issues where the policymakers want to attract and retain small and non-traditional firms into the U.S. defense ecosystem, come play with us, but they're struggling to not keep putting up new barriers to entry. So for example, just to talk about a couple, intellectual property rights, right? If you're the government and you paid a contractor to build something, you want the rights to the intellectual property because you paid for it. And there are certain circumstances where that's the rule and everybody's fine. Then there are things that the contractor developed. And when the government tries to ask for intellectual property rights, particularly with the non-traditional firms, think of the Googles and so forth in the world, the IP is their company. They can't give you their intellectual property rights. They would give up what makes their firm their firm. And so striking the balance between when does the government need the IP rights to protect its ability to compete things in the future versus when the IP rights is cutting the government off from getting new and innovative ideas is a very delicate balance. People of good intention on both sides can often see it from the seat they're in and not see it from the others. When we surveyed our membership, there was, I think about 20% of our memberships had said there are times when they did not bid or they bid a lower quality technology because they did not believe the government would protect their IP rights. So they were not going to risk bidding the latest and greatest for fear that they would lose control over it. That's not what we want when we're trying to get the best and the latest things in. We also have some really old rules that make life challenging. The government has a really hard time buying software. So when it goes to buy software, it often says, well, let me pay the salaries in time and material of the people writing the code. Okay, So I'm the software writer, I give you 3 people, you pay me their salaries plus some percent. You're really not taking advantage of anything I can do for efficiency. In fact, it's sort of encouraging, take longer, take more people. Companies who work in software want to say, value me by what I make in your life a difference. If I can save you $100, pay me 70. But then don't worry about how much I pay for it. That's where my margin comes from. But we don't know how to buy that easily in government. Often we buy software by insisting it be inside something metal, because we know how to buy things made out of metal, and we say, well, just sell it with the metal object. And the software company is like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, that's not the point. The point is we're apps you can download and remove. And so there's a lot of effort to try and figure out how to help the government buy from these innovative software firms who are focusing on creating value and to whom cost plus contracting, time and material doesn't work particularly well. I've talked earlier about the need to expand production. And then, of course, the government penalizes you if you have unused capacity and your overhead rates. And we've talked about supply chain. And this is the whole problem of if you don't let people buy things in advance, advanced procurement is the technical term that the Hill uses for it, then they only start cold. But if I tell somebody with a contract, I'll give you some money for advanced procurement, you can buy the long lead items, often take a year off the production rate. If I guarantee you 5 years of production, not 1 year with 4 one-year options, you can invest in capacity and capability that you wouldn't have if you knew you could lose the contract every single year without warning. These are the types of things that we have to work through in order to make sure that the government is taking full use of the industrial base without creating the challenges and problems. We also have to learn, we talked about buying software. Let me make sure I don't skip over. So let me just wrap up here because I want to make sure I leave enough time for it. The challenge we have right now in the industrial base is many good people in the government are standing on the accelerator to help it go faster, and other parts of the government are standing on the brake, and they don't often know what each other is doing, and so you're getting the mixed signals. The United States is facing a strategic competitor who is stronger than those we have faced in the past. We have seen with Ukraine what a high-end fight with a peer competitor will do on the demand signal for the defense industrial base, and we recognize we're currently not structured to meet that. This weakness is a risk. To effectively deter China, they have to believe in the long run that our defense industrial base will outproduce their industrial base, and time would not be their friend. Our private sector is capable of incredible innovation, is the core of our economic and military strength. It is the reason why we are currently in the lead on technology. You combine that with the incredible training and skill set of the men and women in our armed forces. I would particularly emphasize, I give entire speeches on this other subject, so just pull my thread if you want to in Q&A. But our NCO Corps lets us fight differently because other people don't trust their NCOs to make decisions like we do. I'll just pause there, but I go on that run as one of our 3 strengths, of which the DIB is only one. But to be successful, our industrial base needs to understand the government requirements, and it needs to be able to bring innovation to it. We have to learn how to buy software. We have to reduce the barriers to firms entering the market. We have to prioritize capacity and key things like munitions. And then we must move beyond research to procurement at scale. We did not get into this hole by accident. You get the industrial base that you contract for. If we want capacity and volume and resilience, we will need to value it. All of the things I have said up until this point are things that do not, interestingly enough, since in Washington we are divided on almost every possible issue you can imagine, this does not divide the Republicans and the Democrats. If you look at the National Defense Strategy from 2018 in the Trump administration and 2022 in the Biden administration, both say very similar things about the industrial base, about China as the pacing challenge, and about the technologies for the future. Like many things in government, the most important thing is not partisan, it's just extraordinarily hard. And that's where this comes in. So I'm going to pause here to try and leave as much time as possible. I turned off my watch or my phone so it wouldn't ring, so I haven't the slightest idea how I did for time. Am I good? Okay, excellent. When I'm on the Hill, I have a little light and it goes off after 5 minutes, and most of that I wasn't talking anyhow. So, all right, let me open it up. Whoever's got a question, I will field it, or I will turn and pretend somebody else knows more. Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, there we go. Thank you very much. This was extraordinarily both insightful and well organized in a way that was sort of clear and powerful. And you presented a series of critiques, I would say 95% of the government, all of which I agree with or think you might have been too gentle. So I wonder if I could ask you to look in the other direction, which is when I look at our defense establishment, I also see on the prime side, let's just say problems. Boeing, which apparently has forgotten you need to reattach doors. The story of the F-35, whatever the program ended up being, is not one that anyone would ever want to repeat. There's sort of a lot of things here where there seem to be problems on the other side of the fence. And I just ask, what needs to be done differently there? And what are the policy changes that can generate that?
Sure. So I think with anything that you're doing in volume, you are going to have cases. And so the question is, are you able to detect them? Are you able to remediate them? Are you able to hold people accountable? I won't weigh in on the particular ones for two reasons. One is they're always very fact specific, and it's really easy to annoy people when you start commenting on something you don't. The other is they're all my members, and so I need to be polite. But more important than that, which is having been on the government side as well, what you're trying to figure out is how do I hold people accountable when something is not correct? How do I reward the good behavior for getting there? And how do I know whether or not I created the problem or they did? And so you run into ones of changing requirements and others. But these are the sorts of things that are operating within the larger context, which is, have I made decisions that created a process that doesn't reward the quality of the delivery or something else? And so this is where you have to go back and think, is it either an individual who failed, hold them accountable, company who failed, or did the process set up a series of encouragements that delegated something down or encouraged risk-taking that we don't want to encourage? I'm always cautious because in government, our tendency to having a problem is to add a layer of oversight, which requires 5 more people, a new office, and an IT support, but does not necessarily change the error rate of the problem it's set to regulate. So one of the things I always encourage is figure out the incentive that may have laid behind it and figure out if that is what you need to fix, or whether or not there's an accountability where people can see the consequences and they themselves will put in place their own internal control. But the point I would get to your main point, which is there are good people on both sides of this, and in many cases they used to be on the other side of this. So I have no doubt that the government folks are doing their stuff with the best of intentions. I was there and they're my friends. Same thing on the industry side. What you want to figure out is if we're having repeated problems, why? What did we do? And then the most common one is everything taking way too long, which is amazingly neither side's priority, but everybody's outcome. And then you got to figure out what do I do with that. But a good comment. Thank you. All right, I see somebody way up here. Somebody else may have to help me catch hands. I'll go next. Sure. Let this person in the back corner.
Good afternoon, Judge Nell Jeffries, The Ohio State University. I want to go back to a comment
The Ohio
that you
State
made.
University?
The
Okay.
Ohio State University.
I'm okay with this year and the last few years, but several years ago, this would have been very painful for me. So keep going. You've got a great team this year.
And just so you know, we've patented the D.
Okay.
So earlier in your comments, this is what you said. China is a bigger rival and or threat to the United States than Russia has ever been. And you put the emphasis on ever. So when I read the literature on US relations between China and Russia, that's not an assertion or theme that's featured prominently. So I was wondering if you could expound on that, please.
Sure. And let me clarify. I think if I said it correctly, I tried to say they're a more capable adversary, because it's hard to impute the intent to the Chinese. I mean, the Soviets used to wake up and tell us that they wanted the entire world to be under their control. So they were much more explicit about their behavior. The Chinese are much more capable. First of all, they're physically just a much larger country. We used to say to the Russia was bigger